think the general public is aware that Minnesota State Canvassing Board certified an election where 38.9% of the election ballots cast were not connected to any voters 5 days after their meeting and 25 days after the election? I'm Rick Weibel, and you're watching Midwest Swamp Watch. Let's examine this. This really matters for over 700,000 absentee ballots, and the law is very clear and allows for no leeway whatsoever. So now let me walk you through the facts of the case of what we've got here. So the first part is when we look at the Secretary of State's, Steve Simon's website, it specifically talks about the absentee ballot process. You can definitely look at the links up here at the top and see where I'm getting this information, but highlighted just to make sure when we start out with the discussion here. How do they make sure people can't vote twice? All ballots are tracked individually and linked to a voter in Minnesota's voter registration database. Once a ballot is accepted, if that voter tries to vote again, the election official or election judge will see that the voter has an accepted ballot. So that's important in part of this whole discussion. So now let's look at the actual law here. Now we can see that this is current Minnesota state statutes. And when we scroll down, very specifically, the record of voting, when applicable, the county auditor or municipal clerk must immediately record that a voter's absentee ballot has been accepted. After the close of business on the 7th day before the election, a voter whose record indicates that an absentee ballot has been accepted must not be permitted to cast another ballot at that election in a state primary, general, or state special election for federal or state office. The auditor clerk must also record this information in the statewide voter registration system. The next piece of law is over here. And when we scroll down here, then we see the election official must immediately record that the voter has voted in the manner provided in section 203B 121 subdivision 3. That's the one that we just saw. Now another piece of law here, duties of election judges. When we scroll down to this section, recording accepted and rejected ballots. The election judges shall compare the voter's name with the names recorded under section 203.19 in the statewide registration system. For each returned ballot, the election judges must indicate on the record in the statewide registration system whether the absentee ballot was accepted or rejected. So this is really important as we continue to go through this. So then when we look at the State Canvassing Board, we can also see that here from their website that we can basically click on the Canvassing Board report, and over here we get the board certificate and we can download it over here. And this is the actual canvassing report. And when we look through the report here, we'll notice that they basically combine absentee and mail ballots, regular, then there's absentee federal and absentee presidential. Nowhere in the list, without doing a little bit of calculation, do you actually get the in-precinct voting. And so when we scroll through the bottom here, that's where we actually get the totals going across for each of the sections. So this is the number of total votes. When you add these three sections here, that's the number of mail-in ballots as well as the absentee ballots. Now, mail-in ballots, for some of you that may not understand, in some outstate regions of Minnesota, they don't actually have the ability to show up to a precinct and actually vote because of the distance that's there. So some areas have designated those voters as pure mail-out ballots to get them taken care of, which is a good thing. So the flexibility of Minnesota is great. So when I've created an Excel worksheet here where I've actually put in that information from this worksheet so that you can see that information, and then you'll notice that I had to do some basic math calculation here to basically get the actual in-precinct votes out of this number here. So that's what this worksheet is going to go through as we kind of go through the data here together. Now, when you look at the data that I have, I just want you to understand that any Minnesotan can basically go in and request this data, and this is where you would go in. You can do the request form, and then there's different types of data, and what we're looking at is the voter list with voting history. Now, this is supposed to be directly from that central database that was talked about in the state statutes. So that is our expectation. And how do I know that? Well, if I click on the next page here and we look at the actual state statutes here, that's the assumption that I'm making here of the master list. The master list must be created by entering each completed voter registration application received by the county auditor into the statewide registration system. So that's what this list is that we've been talking about in the previous statutes for the voters and everything else and regarding the absentee ballots. So when we go back over here, you can see kind of what this database has. And I originally got this data set. Here's the inside of that zip file so that you can see the actual data that I've got here. So you've got the election data and then you've got the voter data. And so there's a little bit of a difference. The voter information, these are just straight text files, and you can see the time date stamp of when this was created and then exported. I then used a program called FileMaker Pro to basically import the two separate tables in and to be able to work with the data. And to know that the data that I have is actually valid, you can see one of the voter records here inside is actually at the Secretary of State's office, and we can see that internally here they identify the zip file that this actually came from, and then they also identify the date that they created these records as well. So that's further verification that this isn't made up, that this is actual real data that we are looking at. And then through several searches, we can actually get kind of the numbers of what actually happened in these voter cases. So you'll see up here at the top that I've got about 3.6 million records that I'm working with. Now in this entire data set, you will see that I've got this Excel worksheet here, and when I did basic searches of the raw data from this database, you can see that the absentee ballots that I got was about 1.1 million voters, and that's if I go into the actual database here and I look at just the election history, and that's not connected to the actual voters themselves. So that's where I had to create that other table that I just exited from, so that you can see actually each voter connected to the actual vote. So that's how I joined those together. Basically, when I did the import, I had automatically do a lookup. And you'll actually see that there's a little bit of a variance here as I went through that it appears that there are some voter histories that are there that aren't connected to valid voters at this point in time, or there were voters that may have voted twice or multiple times. And so that's why you'll have this variance between the raw data and then actually connected to a registered voter. And there were a couple of cases that we could actually see that there were multiple absentee records for registered voters. The same thing for mail and precinct ballots as well, and so that's why we see this drop off. Then so when we look at that, that's where we find that it's just absolutely incredible that after we do the basic math calculations from the November 29th data, and we look at the state canvassing report from November 24th, and we do our calculations here, that we can actually see that we're missing absentee mail votes, about well over 700,000 absentee ballots, literally 5 days after the state canvassing board report. And that's just really frustrating. It just seems to be unacceptable. And we also see that we're missing, over 500,000 precinct ballots as well. And there's other discussions for the precinct ballots, but for right now we just need to focus on the absentee ballots, and that's where I showed you the actual state statutes of what those requirements are. And so we do have some serious questions regarding the elections in Minnesota and why the law was not followed. And we have evidence of that based upon the Secretary of State's own data. And that should be very concerning for all Minnesotans. More on this later. Stay tuned.